Having set the context for our Lenten journey in the first two Sundays, on the third Sunday of Lent, the Church introduces in the liturgy, and especially in the readings, the first of three images, which we will hear again and again and again until they reach their climax in the Easter Vigil itself and the celebration of baptism and the renewal of baptismal vows. The first of those themes is water. Now, I must confess that I think one of the great real estate scams in the whole of history is the promise that God will lead his people into a land flowing with milk and honey. The fact is that ancient Palestine was not flowing with milk and honey. It wasn't flowing with anything in particular. It's a fairly dry, arid country. And people who live in such a country, people who live on the edge of a desert, know the value of water. They know that water brings life. That if you have water on your property, a well or a stream, you will live, your crops will grow, your animals will thrive. They know that water is life. They also, however, know that water is dangerous. You may have observed in reading the Hebrew scriptures that we hear a great deal about Israel's army, but we never hear much about an Israelite navy. And the reason is because there wasn't one good port on the whole coast of ancient Israel. This wasn't a seagoing people. And like most people who never have a chance to go to sea, they were frightened of it. They found water to be something terrible and destructive. It's no accident that when they want to picture the whole world being destroyed, they imagine the story in terms of a great flood. It is no accident that when God works his mightiest miracle in delivering his people from Egypt, he does it by opening a sea in order to let them pass through. And that same sea is used to destroy their pursuers. As it says in the Psalms, those who go down to the sea in ships, they see the power of God. And it is no accident that in the New Testament, the miracle that absolutely leaves the disciples speechless, even though they've seen Jesus feed multitudes and heal the sick, is when he's able to calm a storm at sea. It's at that moment when Jesus shows his mastery of the waves that the disciples find themselves asking, is this a human being? What kind of a man is this? Only God has control over the waters. So water is both a symbol of life, but also a symbol of death. It brings prosperity, but it can also bring destruction. And therefore, the Church has traditionally used it as an image both for dying with Christ, being taken into the grave and, as it were, drowned, and also emerging from the water, as emerging from the waters of a womb, that water brings us to life. In the second reading, the passage from Exodus, we find ourselves with the people of Israel out in the desert, where they are beginning to complain that Moses has led them into a wilderness to die of thirst. And Moses turns to God in prayer to ask for aid for his people. And God gives Moses a not very promising piece of advice. He tells him to strike a rock with his staff, and from that rock water flows to slake the people's thirst. Certainly a rock is not an image that we think of immediately as a source of water. Water comes where it's not expected. Well, something of the same is true in the great conversation that we hear in the Gospel passage, the story of Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well. Indeed, the whole passage is dripping with the irony that the fourth Gospel uses so often. Jesus meets the woman at the well at a significant hour. I wonder if you notice that in the passage, John's Gospel, which never wastes a word, makes a point of saying that they met at the 6th hour, that is, about noon. Now there's one other time in John's Gospel when we will hear that something happened at the 6th hour, and it's the moment when Jesus is condemned to death by Pilate. I suggest to you that a very definite comparison, a very definite connection is being drawn between the events of this conversation and their fulfillment in Jesus' passion and death. But for the moment, the conversation begins with Jesus asking the woman if she will give him something to drink. Now this comes as a bit of a surprise because the woman is a Samaritan and Jesus is a good Jew. And Jews and Samaritans simply didn't speak to one another. Certainly Jewish men didn't speak to Samaritan women in deserted spots like this well. Jesus then says to her that if she knew who was speaking to her, she would ask him for water. And he would give her water of such a kind, living water, fresh water, enlivening water, water that would never require her to come to the well to draw water in future. And she, of course, says if he can do that, she'd like that kind of water very, very much. Well, of course, Jesus is playing on this image of water as something that gives life. He's going to tell her that he himself is the living water, that he's the one who, if she accepts him into her life, will give her water that gives life forever. There is a wonderful moment in the conversation where the woman changes the subject. She has just asked Jesus for the living water he's promised her, and he tells her, go and get your husband and bring him back here with you. And she then replies, one suspects somewhat abashedly, I don't have a husband. To which Jesus replies, you're quite right. The man you're living with isn't your husband, and you've had several husbands prior to him. The woman immediately changes the subject, one suspects one knows why, and asks, apparently irrelevantly, well, you Jews say that God is to be worshipped at the temple in Jerusalem. Our ancestors, we Samaritans, have believed that God can be worshipped here at Mount Gerizim. Which is true? And Jesus tells her, the time is coming, indeed the time is very near, when God will be worshipped in spirit and truth everywhere, not only in Jerusalem or on the mountain. The fact is that the woman has been very impressed by Jesus' knowledge of her. How does this stranger know so much about her? She then goes off to the town and tells people that she's met a man who knows everything there is to know about her, who's told her everything she ever did. Could this possibly be the Messiah? The people in the town come out to the well, meet Jesus, and invite him and his disciples to enter the town and stay with them. And at the end of Jesus' stay, according to the fourth gospel, the people of the town say to the woman, we originally went out to find Jesus because of what you told us. Now we believe because of what we have heard for ourselves. That's a very important theme in John's Gospel. Indeed, it's a very important theme throughout all of the New Testament, throughout the whole of the Christian tradition. The insistence is that what we have heard from others gradually becomes our own experience. That's an invitation extended to the catechumens who are preparing for baptism this Easter. It's also an invitation extended again and again to all of us as members of the Church. Not simply to accept what is being said to us on faith in someone else's report, but to gradually come to experience for ourselves the presence of God in our lives. No longer to believe because of what others have told us, but to believe because of what we ourselves have experienced. It's an invitation to incorporate into our lives the reality of that living water. But there's another conversation that happens in this gospel passage. After the woman has left him to go in and tell her townspeople about the man she's had a conversation with, And before they return, Jesus talks to his disciples who have been off trying to find something to eat and now return to him at the well. And they wonder who he's been talking to. Presumably they're a little surprised that he's talking to a Samaritan woman all alone out at the well. And he tells them that he's already eaten. And when they ask where he got food, where he found this nourishment, he tells them that his nourishment is to do the will of the Father who sent him. If Jesus is going to be our living water, it turns out that Jesus' life is the doing of the Father's will. And that therefore, if we are going to live because of Jesus, we too are called to do the Father's will. That to receive the living water of baptism is to enter into a new relationship in God when we will what God wills. Now, what is it that God wills? Well, in fact, we've already heard in the first Sunday of Lent and the second Sunday of Lent, God wills that we be fully and completely his creatures. God wills that we be in the image and likeness of God. God wills that we be human beings. And it is that we are called to celebrate and accept the full depth of humanity, the depth of our createdness in the grace of God. It is that we're being called to accept and to will along with God. The nourishment which Jesus has is to do the will of the one who sent him, and that is to be our nourishment too. In the second reading for this third Sunday of Lent, the passage from St. Paul's letter to the church at Rome, we learn how we enter into the new life of grace, how we accept this living water. It's almost as if the church places this reading on this third Sunday of Lent, in between the passage from Exodus and the story of Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, as a caution to the catechumens and to all of us not to think of the water of baptism as some sort of magic. It's not any quality of the water itself that leads us into the life of grace. It is, as Paul says over and over again in the letter to the Romans, through faith that we enter into the new life of Christ. It is through faith that this living water of which John's Gospel speaks springs up within us. Now, what does it mean to say that we enter this life by faith? Well, it doesn't mean that we accept a certain number of propositions as true, that we believe in God the Father, the maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son incarnate, and in the Holy Spirit dwelling in the church and throughout the world. All of that is true, but simply being able to recognize it as true is not what brings us to salvation. No, St. Paul is very careful in this passage, you will notice, to equate living through faith with living by love. Indeed, it is not simply an acceptance of the truth of the faith. It's an entry into the loving life of the faith that brings us to that living water. And that faith, that loving life of faith, is accomplished, Paul says again in this passage, through the work of the Holy Spirit. It is the Spirit of God within us which finds expression in a faith made active in love, a loving acceptance of the truth of God. Now, the reason I emphasize that is because it takes us back to what we saw in the Gospel passage. That in fact, it's not enough to hear and believe the truth. We must begin to experience the reality of that truth in ourselves, like those Samaritan townspeople who came to believe not simply because of the testimony of their townswoman, but because of what they had heard and seen for themselves. It is the experience of living in love in a community of faith that leads us to recognize the full depth of the baptismal promises that we will be invited to renew in the Easter Vigil, and that the catechumens will be invited to make for the first time this Easter. That life in a community of love and of faith requires a great deal from us. All life in community does, because it involves a willingness to extend oneself to those around us. It involves a willingness to extend ourselves first to do the will of the one who sent Jesus, as we heard in the gospel passage, and secondly, to live in service to one another. That's why Paul, also in this passage, can equate acceptance of grace through faith, of grace through loving life in the Holy Spirit, with being justified in the death of Christ. You remember my making the point that John notes that the conversation with the woman happened at the 6th hour at noon, and that Jesus' condemnation happens at the 6th hour at noon. And I suggested that there's a connection being drawn between those two events. It's because the living water promised to us in this passage in John's Gospel will begin to flow unmistakably in Jesus' giving of himself to his Father in death. It's not that the death of Jesus is some sort of price that the Father demanded in order to release the life of grace into the world. It's that in Jesus' death, we human beings, united with him, give ourselves utterly, totally, and completely to the Father. That we give ourselves totally to God as God's creatures. And creatureliness involves finitude. It involves coming to an end. It involves death. And the ability to accept all of our creaturely existence, even our death, as Jesus obediently accepts death. It is that which leads us into the full, loving faith through the Holy Spirit, which Paul insists is our entry into the living water promised in John's Gospel. That's the theme that the Church sets before us on this third Sunday of Lent, of water as something that gives life, as the baptismal water gives us the new life of the Church, and that life comes to us through our own experience of being fully and totally human in accord with the Father's will, and that we see that full acceptance of the Father's will expressed in a preeminent and unmistakable way in Jesus' acceptance of his own death. But there is one other point that must be noted, and that is that water is something we need to live, that we desire. The Israelites in the desert are dying for water. They're longing for water. It's a matter of life and death. The woman at the well is sick of coming day after day to transport water from the well to her home. She's eager for living water. And it is that longing, that desire, that yearning, that eagerness that the Church wants us to begin to note in ourselves. Lent is not just a process that we go through year after year after year. It's the point where we're asked to discern what it is we really want. And what the Church says to us is, what we all want is to live, and to live fully, to live totally, to have living water, the springs of life within us. And it is that the Church is holding out to us, that promise. Lent is not just a preparation to renew a rite that happened to most of us many years ago, or to celebrate a rite for the first time for the catechumens. Lent is the opportunity to recognize once again what is it we most need, most desire, what is it that we are dying for, and then to accept the good news that what we've been dying for, namely life, has been handed to us as pure gift. Endless possibility, and the start of it is baptism.